Hey guys, MoiDawg here, and today we're taking a look at the next update to Squad, v4.4. This update is a relatively small patch, but it does include quite a few map changes, gameplay updates, and balance tweaks that make for some big changes in how Squad is played, so let's dive right in. First off, we'll be getting some brand new layers to the game, including a new seeding layer, Goose Bay Seed V1 with the USMC versus the PLA, as well as an update for Mutaha Seed V1 to keep all fighting on the small island. For actual playable maps, we now have two additional variants of Manikugan, RAS V8 with the US Army against a regular militia, and RAS V9, which has the Russians up against militia. But we're also going to be getting a layer that most of us probably didn't expect. Mutaha Tanks V1 with the MEA up against China's PLA. This is like Talil tanks where it's armor focused, and each side will not only get 6 MBTs but a handful of IFVs as well, making the initial rollout absolutely insane with 12 tanks on the field. I really like the idea of these other tank layers since I'm a huge fan of armor, but my main complaint with this one is that the lighting layer actually makes it really difficult to play. This sunset mixed with the fog, you can't even see 500 to 600 meters away, and it just makes for the whole engagements just not fun. It's really too bad since the amount of tanks and IFVs rolling around Mutaha is really cool, but when you compare it to Talil tanks and you have some fights that can be anywhere 800, 900, 1000 meters, it just really doesn't compare. In saying that though, if we want to focus on some positive, as much fun as it gives armor players, I do actually think Mutaha Tanks gives a lot of the infantry players a bit more ability to actually help and be effective in game. Yes, you of course have some flanks where you can get in some good armor fights, but if you actually want to control the zones and capture your objectives, you need to go into the city where infantry are going to thrive. This is much better than Talil, where you have just pockets of places like the hangars or the airfield that can completely get sniped if you're trying to reinforce with vehicles from tanks. Overall, I still really like Mutaha Tanks. I think it's a great idea, and I think a lot of y'all will enjoy playing it. I just really think it would be that much better with some normal lighting, and I'm kind of bummed that we have this twilight thing instead of just a regular daytime lighting layer. For some other maps, there are quite a few bug fixes included, but the only real change that's also worth noting is that Korra, Kokan, Logar, and Sumari now have limits on mortars. No matter the faction and no matter the game mode, these maps will now limit squad leaders to 1 mortar per FOB, reducing the effectiveness of indirect fire spam since these maps are the smallest in the game. I think it's a fantastic change since 1 or 2 people in the past could more or less control the entire map, and I'm excited to play games of Korra without immediately being blown up from a mortar now. I also wouldn't be surprised if we see other map tweaks in the future where maybe you don't get some machine guns or ATGMs, things like that, because that makes a little bit more of a variety in the map pool without even changing the maps or the factions, and that's kind of cool. Moving on to systems and gameplay changes, to most everyone's surprise, OWI has actually come in with a pretty heavy-handed nerf to a few Blue 4 factions. The first is a removal of landmines from the British and Canadian combat engineers, and now I've tried to find out exactly why this was removed, but the only real answers I've gotten from active duty or prior service personnel from those actual militaries is that according to British and Canadian doctrine, they don't use landmines. If this is true, let me know. If it's false, also let me know. But that's what I've heard, and I do think it's a really interesting change since OWI isn't trying to make a milsim with Squad. And a lot of times you have to make balance decisions for a game based on your game's gameplay, which might and really oftentimes trumps realism. Realism is fun to a point, but whenever that realism starts to make your game not fun, usually developers try to dial it back, and we see that quite often in something like Squad, which I think has been really tweaked to great effect, and the gameplay loop for Squad is generally pretty good. This change, however, seems like one of those times where, yes, maybe those units don't actually use mines, but if you're up against other conventional factions that use mines, like Russia, PLA, or MEA, then you're really just buffing the enemy player's vehicles. And unless I'm missing something, British and Canadian infantry aren't even receiving any extra anti-tank weapons as well, so this is just a complete buff to whatever factions these ones are now playing since they don't have to worry about driving around and getting blown up. Another odd nerf to the Commonwealth nations is the removal of the ACOG 50 cal bunker on all Canadian and Australian layers. Instead, all of these FOBs will now have the iron sight optic MGs. This is another weird change in my mind, since this iron sight machine gun doctrine is something I've heard about for a long time, and if you don't know what that is, essentially British armed forces don't have optics on their heavy machine guns because gunners would then start to focus on targets and individuals, when the real benefit to having these weapons is suppression. No optics, no tunnel vision, and you can see this if you play the machine gunner kits on these classes as well. There's no optics at all. So this makes sense, but it once again just feels a little bit too much like a nerf of these factions' FOBs as a whole. These MG emplacements are already huge targets, and although every once in a while you can use one effectively, they're more or less death boxes for the users, so offering a bit better optics was a nice trade-off. Now, well, I don't really know if many people are going to be using them as much. Overall, I'm a bit in two minds with these changes, and as much as I like factions to feel different, like the overhaul or regular militia just got, I don't really see this as a big enough change that the factions will really play differently. Instead, it just seems like these will now play like worse US Army or Russian factions, and that's really just not fun. But I am curious on y'all's thoughts on these ones, especially if you are prior service military in any of these actual factions in the real world. There are also a few other kit changes, including reducing the number of grenades from the second lat kit from 2 to 1, as well as adding the RKG-3 anti-tank grenade to the Insurgents. Insurgent Raiders will now be able to use 4 of these giant grenades in addition to their 2 frag grenades, which is an awesome change. Additionally, Insurgent and a regular militia marksman will both be receiving the new infantry camo netting or self-camouflaging, which fits perfectly into those kits. And another small change for a regular militia infantry is that the Saboteur's main weapon will be that new AK-74U with the 45 round banana mag. Moving on to gameplay, there are 2 big changes which you should be aware of for FOB radios and HABs. First, the FOB radio now has a 75-second bleed out timer, up from 60 seconds. Additionally, the health required to save the radio from bleed out has been reduced to 50 HP. Now, this doesn't mean you have to dig the radio up to 50% to save it, but FOB radios have something around 300 health, so this means that it actually is going to take less time digging to save the radio from bleed out. I didn't notice this change too much until I got myself into a situation where I 100% would not have had enough time to save the radio before the update. So although it's not a complete game changer, there will definitely be times where you can save radios when you would have lost them in the past. When it comes to HABs, the disable radius has now been increased to 90 meters, meaning that if you have 9 players within 90 meters of the HAB, it becomes unspawnable and overrun. This is a simple increase from the scaling FOB range we've had for a couple years now, with 2 players being able to disable at 20 meters, 3 at 30, 4 at 40, and so on. And since before v4.4 was 80 meter radius with 8 players, going from 9 players and 90 meters is actually not that big of a change. Still, 90 meters from the HAB is quite far away, and personally I think it would be great if the buildable FOB radius would be increased just a little bit more, something like 25 meters, so that way we have that extra little bit of room to build a little bit more defenses and a little bit more emplacements to keep enemy squads away from the HAB. Either way, this isn't that big of a change relative to what we had before, but you will definitely notice it from time to time since a full squad will be able to overrun you from a pretty far distance. To wrap up the big stuff, the Grad has had a slight buff by increasing the fire rate to twice as fast as it was before, and the airburst rounds have had their blast radius doubled from 1 to 2 meters. For infantry, you no longer receive any speed penalties if you are dragging a body, which is a fantastic quality of life change and should help increase revive since you'll be able to get your buddies behind cover quicker. And if you use the find match button on the main menu, you will no longer be recommended servers that are full and have queues, and instead should be able to play right away. And finally, arguably one of the best changes in this update is a surprising fix for armored vehicles. We can finally swap between the main gun and our coax machine gun without reloading. Yes, tank players rejoice, it finally happened, and oh man, does it make tank combat that much better. Although it isn't a right-click to coax button, what they have implemented is just as good, especially when you consider if they wanted to do right-click to coax, it would probably take forever with all the legacy spaghetti code they have. So in the past, if you were firing your main gun in a tank, for example, but you wanted to swap to your coax for infantry, swapping back to that main gun would then require you to completely reload the weapon, which could get you killed if you needed to fire at an incoming tank. Now, whatever you have selected is actually loaded into the gun, and swapping to your coax just allows you to fire the machine gun without actually unloading the round. As you can see here, swapping back to my Sable rounds is seamless and I can fire right away. And if you were wondering, yes, this also works for your defensive smoke. With your sabot loaded, if you'd like to swap to your other rounds, you will have to then select it and also press R once selected to unload your sabot and then load the new round. This makes sense and it is great in general, but the only real problem right now is that the audio for loading a shell still plays on swap, so it can get a little bit confusing. Still, this quality of life update is a long time coming, and I know I speak for every Armored player when I say thank you. No, seriously, thank you so much. There are quite a few other bug fixes and tweaks included in this update, which you will most likely not even notice in your day-to-day gaming, but if you would like to see the entire patch notes, I've linked them down in the description down below. But what do you guys think? Is there a good amount of content for a little surprise update, or are you unsure about the British, Canadian, and Aussie faction changes? Or maybe you have some more questions about some of the balance changes to radios and halves. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. But that's it for me. Until next time, peace.